Welcome to MHN Voices, our new series through which we'll be presenting insightful discussions among industry thought leaders, moderated by our editorial team. We kick off our series with an examination of the affordable housing market today and new strategies to meet the huge demand in the face of the continued growth in housing costs and limitation of tax credits. I'm Suzanne Silverman, Editorial Director of Multi-Housing News, and I'm here today with three affordable housing leaders. Alice Carr joined April Housing as CEO this spring following Blackstone's launch of this LIHTC leader to provide solutions and capital for the creation and preservation of high-quality affordable housing. Alice brought to it more than 25 years of experience in affordable housing and community development. Daryl Carter is Chairman and CEO of Avanath Capital Management, which he founded in 2008 to focus on acquisition, renovation, and operation of apartment properties, with an emphasis on affordable and workforce communities. Avanath has since acquired $2.5 billion worth of properties, and Daryl has a long history in real estate investment and financing. Greg Voyancy is CEO of longtime real estate investment manager and leading LIHTC syndicator Boston Financial. Greg joined the firm in 1999 and has more than 28 years of affordable housing and LIHTC experience. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and I'd like to thank our sponsor for today's webinar, Excalibur Capital. We're recording this session, and it will be available for later viewing. In addition, we're going to leave room at the end to answer your questions, but please feel free to submit them at any time during the webinar. Thank you to those who submitted some in advance, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. Let's kick off today's discussion with a couple of broader questions about what's happening now with affordable housing, and then we can talk more specifically about new approaches and ideas. Greg, why don't I ask you first about the greatest recent advances in financing affordable housing construction?
All right. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here today. Why don't I start off by saying that I think both sides of the political aisle can agree, and we all probably agree, and the listeners agree, that there is a critical shortage of affordable housing in the U.S., and it's only worsened during COVID. Furthermore, I'd say that the consensus is that new supply is likely to slow down even more this year due to some stuff we'll talk about later, I'm assuming, some development budget gaps. So more than ever, as an industry, I think we need some new financing solutions along with augmenting the tax credit program and maybe some legislative fixes for that. So overall, I will say that throughout the years that I've been doing this, the industry has always been very resilient and very creative in solving these gaps. Nowadays, it's not unusual to see a development budget with 4, 5, 6 or more sources of funding to just make a deal work. So some of the high level things that we're seeing now, and maybe not all are necessarily new, but maybe in greater frequency or quantity. We are seeing more and more states adding a state tax credit program. They can be complex sometimes, but we're seeing more of that. We're seeing firms, some firms allowing longer amortization of loans, 45 years, sometimes interest only. We've seen in 2020, we saw a 4% fix that has significantly increased proceeds for tax credit deals. So that was very helpful. And then we're also seeing some significant increases in the awareness and demand for social investments, which I say is a new, not necessarily new, but a bigger push in our business from the outside. And so it's resulted in some new ESG investment dollars flowing into the industry, which is a very positive change for us. So I think it's just becoming, the topic of affordable housing is becoming more and more mainstream than ever before. We've also seen in the last couple of weeks changes in the Treasury regulations that allow some of the ARPA proceeds that were kind of hung up flow to tax credit transactions now. So hopefully we'll see those dollars getting into deals. And then I guess on a high level, lastly, I'd say that it's kind of interesting. We're starting to see more and more of the market becoming acceptable of the stability of cash flows from affordable housing communities. And as a result, we're seeing some of these cash flows being rated and then monetized. And while that doesn't necessarily translate to direct units of construction or new construction, it does create some level of liquidity in the market. So that's an interesting phenomenon that we're seeing right now. Those are some of the high level things.
Great, thank you. Alice, what do you have to add to that? Can you comment on the biggest changes today to supplying more affordable housing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to look at how far we've come as an industry. When you look at kind of what's happened over the last, even if you go back 50 years, right, the way that affordable housing was created has changed a lot. And with the inception of LIHTC in '86, all of a sudden you had a really great way of building housing that brought together private enterprise and public resources and public oversight. It's heavily regulated. There's lots of costs involved, but at the same time, it really created kind of aligned incentives for developments to get done with public-private partnerships in a way that they hadn't gotten done before. And with almost 3.5 million homes created under the low-income housing tax credit program, it's pretty successful. We know that there are challenges to it, but it's pretty successful. And then when you layer into the actual program, I think one of the outstanding things about LIHTC is that it's bipartisan supported, and we can all agree that that's pretty rare in these times, that you have programs and policies that that both sides of the aisle can get behind, and that's been really important. And I think that's part of the secret to the success of the program going forward, and how we will get more resources and continue to develop under this program. When you layer onto that some of the advances that have been made around modular and other types of construction, and we can talk about that later, the building of affordable housing has just gotten more sophisticated as folks have understood the absolute stability of this asset class. It's attracted more types of capital and increased increased the amount of capital coming into this industry, and the risk adjusted investments can be seen in how people are putting their money towards this industry. So it's become a lot more sophisticated, and there are more sophisticated tools fueling how affordable housing gets done today. It's not to say that there aren't a lot of challenges that we still face. And I think some of those challenges are, right now we're kind of in a perfect storm when you look at some of these big challenges. And while we've talked about how important the low-income housing tax credit tool is, there isn't enough, right? And it's been very effective, but it's not enough to really move the needle in the way that we need to move the needle across the country. And in many cases, with rising costs of land, material, labor, et cetera, you have low-income housing tax credits not being enough to make a project pencil. And so you're looking for local, state, other types of funding to fill gaps to get a project to pencil for these oversubscribed resources. And it creates a lot of timing issues. It creates competition. It creates an unpredictable nature of when and how you can get housing built. And so we are kind of in a perfect storm right now. Add to that, fluidity and changing interest rates, increasing costs. You add that to, the long timeline that it takes to get affordable housing lined up, given zoning and regulations and onerous policies. I mean, there are a lot of challenges that we could work on streamlining to increase the quantity of housing that we build. The quality is there, the quantity needs to increase.
Okay, thank you. And Daryl, could you touch on the amount of impact you anticipate from the rising interest rates that Alice alluded to, and the anticipated recession, to whatever extent that ends up hitting us?
Well, first, I'd like to say thanks to you, Suzanne, and Multi-Housing News for sponsoring this. And just maybe to touch on one thing, since Alice was kind enough to mention history of this industry, and I think in some respects, Greg and Alice represent two ends of history. Just a quick digression, as a graduate student at MIT in 1981, my thesis advisor was married to one of the founders of Boston then financial technology company, Randy Hawthorne. And your company is really one of the pioneers who really built the affordable housing business. And today, Alice's company, which was sponsored by Blackstone, they represent the new of private equity moving into this space. And I think it's a very, very good time. And I would echo that. When you look at the movement of interest rates, while they have gone up from all-time lows. You know, the heyday of this business, if you look at from 1995 to 2010, interest rates were on average higher than they are now. And certainly there's a shock because every dollar means a lot, particularly on new construction. But I think the market, my view is the market will adjust. From our standpoint, we are primarily in the acquisition and preservation business. We are also funded by private equity in the same way that, not in the same amounts as Alice's company, but the same institutional investors. And we tend to be a low leverage investor. So most of our deals today, we are no more than 50 to 60% leverage. So it certainly has an impact, but not as much in our business. But I can certainly say from, I sit on the board of Bridge Housing, which is a prolific, affordable housing nonprofit. And, the interest rates and getting these very complicated deals done, particularly in markets like California, every dollar matters. And so, again, I think, Greg touched on the fact that, the supply issues are really, trying to figure out how we get more supply is our biggest challenge.
And let's touch on the current legislation or recent legislation before we dig deeper into the financing options and public-private partnerships and so forth. Greg, maybe if you could comment on the most important takeaways about the Biden administration's housing supply action plan, and as well as with the year-end tax package, what some of the things you are looking to advance.
Sure. Daryl, I appreciate that was a good segue into the supply side, right? So by way of background, just for people listening, earlier this year, the White House released a pretty comprehensive plan, and it's called the Housing Supply Action Plan, and it's designed to, the premise is to help close this shortfall of supply that, and the time frame for that was a 5-year plan, right? And so it's a combination of some legislative approaches and some regulatory steps. So first off, I applaud the administration for putting the plan out there. It's certainly needed. And secondly, housing is extremely complicated. It's a topic that is very challenging to fix. Yeah. So I'd say they're also tackling a problem that's a 40 or 50-year-old housing shortfall problem, and you're kind of running up and down escalators where we are at this stage of the game. So the plan itself, there's a few main points of emphasis for affordable housing. Certainly has some expansion of the low-income housing tax credit in there. It has some stuff about the final income averaging test guidance, which is sorely needed. It encourages the alignment of some of these various subsidies. There's a lot of subsidies that go into making these deals work, and it gets complex, and you have developers piecemealing a lot of components together, and it becomes costly and complicated. HUD, CBG money, USDA, and sometimes you pair some of these things up, and it's not only costly but complicated. So some of the bills or some of the plan is to address that, and then it does touch on the GSEs as well, and trying to make them more involved in increasing their participation in the equity investments. So will it be successful? I don't know. Again, it's a complex issue. I think the regulatory components of the plan can and are being implemented and addressed by the administration. However, the legislation components, there are legislative components that depend on acts from Congress. And as we saw, unfortunately, in the recent Inflation Reduction Act, it didn't really focus on housing. It had some helpful stuff in it, but it didn't really focus on it the way I think a lot of industry participants would have liked to have seen it. So again, the positive takeaways from the plan as presented earlier this year was, one, right, the administration's clearly focused on expanding housing supply, and specifically the low-income housing tax credit, which will hopefully, again, help in any future legislation. And two, the administrative is certainly interested in making improvements that can be accomplished through the regulatory side, so no need to go through Congress. And examples of that are the ARPA dollars I mentioned earlier, and hopefully the income averaging test, and maybe even some relief for placed in service deadlines. So the second part of your question was, where do we go from here and what happens? And so to get some of these legislative changes in, we're now looking at a year-end tax package. to advance these priorities. There are a number of expiring tax provisions this year that are popular, have bipartisan support, like R&D. So there likely will be a year-end tax extenders bill. And I think, so lobbying efforts will be crucial this year. And I would certainly encourage anyone listening to participate to the extent they can, either at the national or even local level. We always encourage people to reach out to the local governments and have people come to ribbon cuttings, things like that, because I think those grassroots movements do filter their way up into DC. So I think that's important. Boston Financial participates in the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition. In a recent conversation I had with the coalition, we talked about some of the top priorities for the year. At the very least, extending the 12.5% allocation increase that expired, lowering the 50% test to 25% test would be extremely helpful. Adding any additional housing credit allocation on top of that 12.5% would be helpful. And then certainly anything else we can add from the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, for example, a basis boost. I can't stress how important it is to have our voices heard. So I think if there's any takeaway from that component, I would say try to get involved in some of these things.
Daryl, Greg touched on the GSEs. Can you talk about their revised housing goals and the impact that they've had?
Well, these just came out about a week ago. I think what's interesting, the housing goals are now quantified as a percentage of the business versus number of units, which, as I did the math of that, it significantly increases the affordable housing goals. The other regulatory thing that that I think is right now in play, there is a rewriting of the Community Reinvestment Act, which was originally written in 1977, and it was based on a branch banking system that no longer exists. And I think some of the modernization, and I've reviewed it, I like a lot of what the new regulations do, but hopefully that will spur more capital from the banking side into affordable housing.
Okay, thank you. Greg, how much can the current financing options relieve the shortage of affordable housing, and how much more is needed, and how urgently? And some of this, I guess we've touched on so far, but maybe we could delve into that a little more.
Sure, I can add a little color to that, I suppose. I think so. The urgency, again, it's immediate, right? If that's the metric, and it's crucial. There are a lot of metrics that are thrown around about how big a shortfall exists in the country right now, and the one published by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, they use 6.8 million unit shortfall for very low income households, which are included in their calculation, right? And so our current pace of production has been about 100,000 a year. So the supply side of this, if you're looking at demand and supply side, we have a long way to go. And even if you don't agree with the 6.8 million, even if you think it's half of that, I think we all still recognize there's a huge problem. So to couple that, I would also add in, we shouldn't forget about the aging population, aging supply also, right? So out of all of the units, the rental housing stock in the country, not just affordable, but total, about 40% of it is over 30 years old. So we have a supply side issue for new, just the creation, and then the existing aging is also a big issue from the renovation standpoint. So the financing, some of the financing options that we've spoken about will help make current deals pencil, but frankly, I don't think there's enough. I think the incremental increases in funding, unfortunately, have not really kept pace with the increasing land and construction costs and higher interest rates that we just touched on. Again, the ARPA funds that I mentioned earlier, they'll help maybe some stalled deals from 2 years ago, but they're a finite source of funding, and they're a stopgap. As I mentioned, state credits, it's great when states add these credits, but they add a significant level of complexity to deals, and you still need investors in that particular state with a state tax credit, state tax liability, right? So I am very hopeful that we'll continue to see growth in ESG investing in affordable housing. I think, again, that could be a very large boon to this need. So I'm very optimistic that will be a continuing trend. And then, as Alice mentioned and Daryl mentioned, it's the tax credit program it's over 3 decades old now, right? And it needs some legislative change to make it more meaningful in today's environment. So I think, while ultimately a solution will need to come from a number of different sources and programs, and we're talking about the supply side today, really more than anything else. I guess I would say that the demand side of the equation does need help as well, and that needs to be tackled. And those are things like community programs for education, training, family and community support, quality changes, things like that on the demand side. I think also need to continue to get focus.
So let's talk some more about what this, where you all are finding success. Alice, I'll start with you. Tell me about the kinds of financing approaches you're taking, the kinds of funds that you're offering, and then go to each of you.
Absolutely. So April Housing is a fairly unique organization or company. We were launched earlier this year, and we actually own 90,000 units of LIHTC housing in over 40 states across the country. And so we are owner operators of LIHTC housing that exists. And so we have, that's one piece of our business. And we have obviously concerns around preservation, right? So we have on that portfolio about 20 years of affordability left under the current LORAs or restrictions on the property. So and we know that of that, of that average, we have some that will be coming up and maturing in the next few years that we need to get in front of and we need to think about now. And so preservation is a huge issue for us, and there aren't a lot of off-the-shelf preservation tools available across the country. And so that's one of the things that we really are looking at very closely. Some states, have great property tax exemptions. Some can you can re-syndicate. There are local solutions that we're looking at. We're working with housing authorities and state governments to figure out preservation tools for the specific properties in our portfolio. And that's something that, kind of keeps me up at night. We are also in the process of closing our first low-income housing tax credit investment. It's a large, almost $50 million investment in Arizona, and we will continue to explore our role in investing in LIHTC equity and building out that platform. But we also have access to other types of private equity that can be used in other ways to be accretive to the industry and to find new ways to get affordable housing across the spectrum developed. So, we are relatively new in our outlook, but I guess we're a startup with 90,000 units. So we've got a lot on our minds and a lot to think about, and we have resources to bring to the industry.
Okay, great. Thank you. Daryl, tell us what you're doing. I think you're on mute.
Our primary business is a preservation business, and probably if you were to say a strategy that we've adopted lately is to buy older non-rent regulated apartments that would be considered naturally occurring affordable apartments, and partnering with a local agency. And we've done this in Boston. We just closed a deal in LA, a large acquisition that we partner with the Housing Authority of Los Angeles, where in exchange for putting affordability restrictions on the property, we get a tax abatement or some other inducement. I think this is a great strategy for preserving older housing that operates in the same space as LIHTC. And with those inducements of a tax credit, I mean, the property we're buying in LA, which is almost 700 apartments, and we're we're doing a significant renovation. And this is a property that was built in the 40s that has there's not the electrical capacity for people to have dishwashers. And our renovation, we're redoing the entire electrical system. And so this is a strategy that we believe, and we've gotten a lot of housing authorities and other public entities contacting us interested in rolling out that in other cities. And so that's a key part of our growth, or partnering with public agencies and really bringing new capital to bear on the preservation business.
Okay, thank you. Greg, do you have more you wanted to talk about on this?
Suzanne, can I just comment quickly? I think that
Sure.
that is such an important approach and such an innovative way of thinking about how public-private partnerships can lock in affordability. And, Daryl and his company have a proven track record. And so they can come in and work with a local agency to lock in affordability and to create value in an area where, that's a lot of housing. That's a lot of housing that, probably would have been lost over time if it didn't get the type of reinvestment that you're bringing to it, Daryl. So it's an incredibly inspirational idea, and it really shows how those public-private partnerships are going to be part of the solution outside of LIHTC, which is a very useful tool and creates new housing and has, it has been a great tool across the country. But we need to think outside the box, and we need to think of ways in sometimes in a less expensive way of leveraging some other resources to create housing across the spectrum. It's really, really innovative and inspirational.
Thank you very much, Alice. The reality is there's just simply not enough public capital to meet the need of affordability in this country. I mean, there's just not, and we have to be more innovative. And it's something I'd wish and if you look at the history, and I go back to the formation of your company, Greg, in the early years. I mean, a lot of what was done, it was before the tax credit program, but it was done through different tax incentives that enabled private capital to invest. So, there are a lot of good ideas that have worked, and sometimes we have to bring back old stuff to the world today. But, that was essentially the strategy of Boston Financial circa 1980.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There was the old tax loss partnerships and just other ways of looking at funding these properties. And you're right, there's just not enough, currently there's not enough sources of capital to get the supply to where it needs to go. I'll say we're focusing again on a lot of what we do still is our core business, right? Every year we raise tax credit equity and we deploy that. And last year we did about $1.3 billion of equity raise and deployed in 90 to 100 properties. So we'll continue to do that. And I think as part of those things that we're adding to our funds, we are adding social service accounts or reserves to those types of funds, which is a new thing that we've been doing along with investors. We're basically putting money into those funds to use for social service components. And during COVID, we set up a fund, and one of these funds had a reserve that was used towards purchasing iPads for every tenant, and it helped them stay connected during COVID. It helped family properties have the children remain connected to school, and so we've done some things like that in our tax credit funds. Similar to Daryl and Alice, we also are in the preservation world. We did launch our first preservation fund a year ago, and so again, it's I think given the housing stock and where deals are coming off of their compliance period, it makes a lot of sense. It's just a tremendous flow of deals that need to remain affordable, and they're in a very precarious place because they need recapitalization. And to figure out ways to make that work, first of all, it's interesting and exciting to do, but it's housing stock that exists and you don't want to lose out of the affordable world. So we do have a preservation fund. We'll launch our second preservation fund this year as well. And then we recently did get our Community Development Financing Institution designation from Treasury. So we are a CDFI now. And so hopefully this will allow us to provide lower cost loan products to affordable housing as well. And so that'll be a big push for us in this upcoming year. And then lastly, I'd say we are part of a larger company, Boston Financial now. And we do give back a significant amount of money. Last year, we donated about $2 million to 40 nonprofits. And then on top of that, our employees feel very altruistic about what we do as well. And they donated $300,000 personally. And then we match that again at the corporate level with another $300,000. So I think being part of this community, we feel like giving back is a very important step of that. So.
I want to add to that. I think one of the great things that that Alice and Greg and I won't speak for them, but a lot of we have 450 employees. They are attracted because of the mission. and it's a great mission. I mean, I think, our next generation of leaders, they get excited by that. And that's something, I mean, certainly we're in this world of the great resignation. But, I think it's something that people want to be a part of.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And, we have been hiring, we've been in a hiring frenzy over here at April Housing. We've brought on 30 new employees in the last 4 months. And you can tell by who we're hiring what our priorities are. We just hired a head of preservation, right? Our company now has, at a very high level within the company, a head of preservation who will focus on our portfolio and extending affordability. And then really focused on residents, right? Really beefing up our asset management and how we look at our residents. And the end result of what we're doing every day is to provide great homes to residents. And so I'm really focusing and listening to residents to find out what's working and what's not. Yeah, but the staffing is really tough. And I think that as the company starts to make some really bold steps in proclaiming our goal towards preservation and building and scaling, we're attracting a lot of great talent, and it's great.
I think certainly from the conversations we had leading to this hour, we were talking a lot about investors getting inspired similarly. And I think, Daryl, I'm not sure if it was you who was talking about foreign investors that have really been interested in getting involved with with affordable housing.
Well, the one thing about, and I started this company in 2007, 2008, and that was obviously a very difficult time right before the crash and subsequent recovery. But, one of the things in the US that there's still stigmas of affordable housing. People think about, when you say affordable housing, people think of Cabrini Green. They think of, there are these images of what that looks like that sometimes, and even certain things like half of our, 16,000 households are Section 8 recipient holders. And people say, oh, Section 8, I don't really want that. And then you say, well, I mean, I'm a person that believes very strongly in analytics. I said, you know what? Our historic default rate on our Section 8 portfolio is 11 basis points. And you drop the mic, because these myths come up. And so one of the things, as we, probably 10 years ago, because we get so many people that say, oh my God, we don't like the quality of that, or, oh, it's unproven, or why it's a niche business. And we started looking outside the US. And one of the things we found is that in many other countries, and specifically where we have had success raising capital, the Netherlands, Switzerland, the UK, and Germany, if you look at institutional investors in those places, they invest very broadly in affordable housing as well as higher end housing, but they do various segments. So it's a cultural thing that they feel very, they feel very comfortable with, and to touch a third rail for a second, one thing that the affordable housing, in the US, things get mixed involved in it that shouldn't. Matters of race and, oh my God, is this going to be gangs or what, things like that have nothing to do with the business. Because, I grew up in Detroit, on the west side of Detroit, where there's affordable housing needed. We need it just as much in a lot of rural communities. So it really has, the face of affordable housing has no color. It has no, there's just a staunch need. And I think in this country, the NIMBYism and everything else, people are concerned about who the people are that live in affordable housing. And one of the things, we have a development that's not too far from where I grew up in Detroit, where we're getting some political opposition. And one of the things we say, look, our property, is going to house your kid who just graduated from college that makes $40,000 a year, has 100,000, well, I guess probably now 90,000 of debt. And and they're either going to live at home or they're going to live in affordable housing. And most people, they have these nightmarish perceptions of what affordable housing looks like. And I think certainly, investors like Blackstone and what Alice is doing is helping change the narrative quite a bit.
Well, I would say, I worked in banking for over 20 years before joining April Housing, and really watching affordable housing prove itself as a very stable investment, as a very stable asset class that's happened over the last 30 years, right? And so, watching even just internally at these leading financial institutions, how the cost of capital around affordable housing is different than other investments, where you look at risk-rated adjustment and you actually see that these are incredibly safe and stable investments on the lending and the investing side. And now with the track record behind us of decades of very low foreclosure rates and very low recapture rates, you can see that in how LIHTC is priced, and you can see that with who's coming into the space and how it's getting done. Blackstone coming in and purchasing the portfolio that seeded April Housing. It's one of the largest investments in affordable housing to date. And that is just a huge vote of confidence in this asset class. So we should be encouraged by that. We still have lots of challenges, but nobody can solve this problem without private equity, without additional capital sources coming in. And then combined with public-private partnerships, we will continue to drive progress. We need new tools, we need new solutions, and we need new sources of capital. None of that can be disregarded.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you just said about the stability and the institutional investor starting to understand that a little bit more, right? And you're seeing it, and that was one of the examples I gave earlier on. I kind of alluded to, we didn't get into depth, but some developers now with large portfolios of tax credit deals are getting their cash flows securitized. They're getting it rated by a big rating agency. They're securitizing, and they're selling that on the secondary market. It's because there's a recognition that the cash flows are stable. It's borne itself out. I look at our portfolio. We have 2,100 properties in our portfolio. Our average debt service coverage is 140. Our average occupancy is 98%. And I can't recall the last time we had any kind of foreclosure on a deal in a portfolio that size. It's tremendous, right? So I think that brings a liquidity to the market. It's a relatively new phenomenon, which is interesting. But I couldn't agree more. The NIMBYism stuff is I think the investors are starting, they have a different perspective than I think some of the communities and developers are still facing. I think some significant difficulties with NIMBYism from the developers I speak with. And I think education is the leveling agent. I think more education, explanation of what properties look like, how they act, how they'll impact the community. I think that's how you solve these problems. And education solves a lot of problems, not just this problem, but overall, my wife's a teacher, or was a teacher, so I trump up education quite a bit, but I think it's important.
Certainly, combating the NIMBYism is challenging, but you are starting to hear that term YIMBYism, where there's more of that to think about. But I think that shifts us nicely into the topic of public-private partnerships and working at that local level. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about that. What kind of opportunity is there in public-private partnerships now, and how is that changing? Alice, should I ask you that one first?
Yeah, I think Daryl gave a fantastic example of, taking a very large project and using a public-private partnership to lock in affordability. And we are very concerned about our own existing 90,000 units and how to preserve and really looking to any sort of tools that can be available to us to lock in that affordability. And there is varying degrees of sophistication depending on, which government entities you're talking to and at what level, local, state, federal. And, some cities and states have really recognized that when they prioritize affordable housing and use their own resources, they're typically leveraging federal resources as well. And those who are less sophisticated are really leaving those dollars on the table that they could get from the federal government. And so when we are working with housing authorities, we are working with our partners, we are thinking of ways to lock in affordability using property tax abatement, re-syndication, just locking in affordability, working with a public agency, looking at Section 8 programs that might be going on in certain cities where Section 8 recipients are having trouble finding places to live. So we are kind of turning over every stone and trying to think creatively and innovatively, and be at the table with public agencies to come up with better preservation tools.
You know, I would add, I would agree with all of what Alice just said, but one of the things that I think probably most people don't know about, you know, some of the things with housing authorities and public agencies, and I look at we have relationships with about 61 agencies nationally, and you know, when we go and visit with them, they are very proactive and they are very solution oriented. And you know, and I could think of some that stand out. You know, King County up in Washington, and Florida Housing Finance Agency. We have a lot there, and we go to Tallahassee. You know, and City of Chicago Housing Authority, LA. You know, Housing Authority of LA, where people you sit down in a room with people who are open-minded to, you know, trying to solve the affordable housing challenge. And we found that our public agencies are partners that are very in lockstep with us to try to come up with great solutions to preserve in most cases, but to create affordable housing. So, you know, many of these public agencies are maligned, or the perception, but we have found that when we go in and visit, they're very, very happy to talk to us and explore solutions.
What are, how can we draw on those really great examples and bring them elsewhere? What are some creative partnerships that you can suggest in other areas that might help them not just embrace the idea, but even if maybe they've embraced the idea but don't really know how they can pull it off? What are some ways that you're finding now, that maybe new creative ways that could really help pull together all the partners needed to help them move forward? Anybody's got a really interesting example of that, maybe?
Let's see. You know, I would say that, you know, in most instances, you know, at the end of the day, we're all trying to solve for keeping rents at 60% of AMI and at a return that attracts, in our case, institutional capital. And so those are the two things you're solving for. And you know, I think in general, there is an openness to, if the entity has a, you know, I don't think that, you know, people want to see, a housing authority wants to see you get a 20% return and treat the residents like, and have really unsatisfactory housing. They don't want to see that. They want to see that you provide quality, and they're willing to be, you know, open in trying to help attract the capital to there. So, you know, I think that most of the solutions as we go to different agencies tend to be more bespoke and kind of customized. And I think, you know, one of the things that is really the positive, you know, people ask, well, my God, you know, when Blackstone came into this business, what do you think? And I said, hooray. And I say hooray for one reason. I mean, candidly, you could double as big as Blackstone and as big as Boston Financial. You could triple them, and we still won't make an impact on the need for affordable housing that's out there. It's important for people to understand that. And they'll say, well, my God, aren't you worried about this, or, you know, all the other competitors? But, you know, one of the things that I find really valuable that I like about the affordable space, and many of our competitors, we are always collaborating and talking to and saying, hey, have you thought about this or thought about that? Because it's a very hard business. And, we need all the great ideas and we need all the investors because we just simply don't have enough public capital to address the need.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we are 45 minutes in and we should turn to some audience questions as we have quite a few. I want to give our audience a chance to get some of those answered. Our first question is, how can a new affordable housing developer learn about new projects, federal tax credit offerings to do a first project? What are decision makers looking for?
Well, that's a tough question, right? So it's again, the credits are allocated by state, and every state has a slightly different twist to what they're looking for in their QAP when you do the application process. From an investor standpoint, we're obviously looking for a good partner with that will stand behind their deal, and I can tell you throughout our history that the partner that we select is probably the most important component to a successful deal. I've seen deals that are tremendous deals on paper with a bad partner, and they should have been in a good market and just went the wrong way. And conversely, I've seen deals where a good partner stands behind their deal and can make a bad deal work and get to the end of the compliance period. So we look at partners, obviously their financial wherewithal, but how they act in good times and bad times tells you a lot too over the years. So how does a new person get into it? There's a lot of industry conferences, events. I think you'd find that, as Daryl eloquently pointed out, everybody in this industry knows each other very well, and I think everyone's very friendly and very helpful. And there's a competition among us, obviously, but I've referred deals over to our competitors in the past. So I think we tend to work together to make these deals work, I think, for the better cause. So there's a lot of resources out there. I don't know if that directly answers the question, but I don't know if anybody else wants to take a stab at that too.
Look, I would say that question pains me a little bit because there are significant barriers to entering the LIHTC development space, right? And it's very complicated. Many allocating resources require experience to win allocations. So, you figure that out. So you see a lot of newcomers joint venturing and getting their foot in the door by working with others who are more experienced or have been in the industry for a while, doing joint ventures and figuring out how it gets done before they actually go out on their own and develop on their own. In many cases, as you're starting out in development, the deals that you cut with your financing partners might be different because the guarantees won't be as strong, et cetera. So there are barriers to entry. There's no sugarcoating that, but there are definitely steps you can take by leveraging off of those who are well ingrained in the industry.
Okay, we have a question now for Daryl. From our perspective as a nonprofit mission-oriented development, the LIHTC is becoming increasingly ineffective. Are there any new approaches out there enabling us to accomplish our mission of increasing the supply of affordable housing without being captive to the onerous and counterproductive rules of HUD and the state and local housing agencies?
We don't do a lot of development, but I mentioned we're doing a ground up development in Detroit. We typically get involved in two situations with development. One is where there's almost a public-private venture. What we're doing in Detroit is on some city-owned land, and that makes it an attractive acquisition. But we're doing it. We're privately financing it, and we have I think it's a 30% affordability requirement, which is. And the numbers work. And so, finding ways of, I think in terms of acquiring assets, I mean, the one thing that, I have a few friends in the business who are looking at are some of these retail centers. I mean, retail, that we are way oversupplied with retail, and there may be some interesting conversion opportunities. And so, there are ways of doing it, and there is private capital. you know, and it's public, so I can say it. Bridge Housing just did a very large investor structure with involving Morgan Stanley and I believe the National Equity Fund. So there are nonprofits that are going and finding private capital as well, because I think you really need, you know, a private capital solution, because the LIHTC business won't fit everything.
Okay, we've got another question. You all have spoken about the stability of an affordable asset and the capital markets recognizing this. What does this mean for the development of institutional capital that could be a surrogate for LIHTC and preservation transactions? And add to that the buzz around social investing and ESG investing.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly ESG investing, it's a slightly different animal in that institutional investors are coming into the market and willing to take a slightly lower return, right, for ESG investments. I think so that by nature gives you something that's a little bit below market on the supply side. I think, you know, I don't know. It's a, you know, again, I don't know. I mean, Daryl, I don't know if you had anything to add to that either, but it's bringing these additional capital sources in certainly can help increase the supply. I think that's what's needed. But
well, I think that, you know, one of the analogies I look at in our business, when we started raising capital 2008, 2009, we would tell large institutional investors, well, the primary business is institutional, high quality stuff. So you should be, this is a great niche you should be in. And it, you know, I like to look at the history of other industries, and in the early 60s, everyone kind of laughed at Sam Walton when he was creating this that was very different from the august, respectable Macy's and other department stores. And ultimately, he appealed to the mass amount of people, and then others like Target and Kmart and that whole world became bigger than the department store world. And in many respects, I see an analogy like that with very little institutional capital today. You know, 8% of we look at the naturally occurring affordable housing and the rent regulated space at roughly 10 million units. And the top 50 owners own 8% of the space. So it's highly fragmented. And, you know, the opportunities for institutional capital in that segment versus the A segment, where there is significant institutional ownership there, creates a great opportunity.
Next question, what role will manufactured housing play in the short-term recovery and moving forward? And I particularly like this question both for the affordable alternative and aspect, and because we wanted to get into supply chain issues, and I think there's something there where that we can address with this question as well.
I would say one of the most exciting things I've seen around kind of modular or manufactured housing is kind of the flexibility of how and where it can be built. And I think that could be a real game changer. When you look at certain cities that have very small urban infill sites that have in the past been undevelopable because there isn't a place for staging or there isn't a place for large project to go up. If you can find ways for these kind of pop together types of housing that's built off site and then can create anywhere from 10 to 20 units in a very small urban infill site, that really can be a game changer for many cities. And there is a lot of work getting done around that.
Okay, I have one that's more of a regional focus, but this person is asking whether the Northern California markets have or need special solutions for affordable housing versus other parts of the state or the country. They may have stumped her.
I would just say yes. Yes, because Northern California is always special.
Well, I would argue, I would say I mean, markets that it's extremely high cost to build.
Yeah.
I mean, you could add New York, you could add Southern California, Orange County. I mean,
Yeah.
it's very expensive to build and it requires a lot of capital.
In Seattle, yeah.
Okay. A question for Daryl. How do you exit your investments and still preserve or ensure renter affordability of assets sold?
Very good question. You know, we've really evolved our business model. Initially, we've done a series of closed-end funds that, you know, had termination dates that generally are 10 to 12 years, which by nature you have to have some kind of event at the end of it. And we have now, you know, so we've done a series of those vehicles. At the end of 2021, we closed an open-ended vehicle and we essentially sold our funds 1 and 2 into that, and that will be our primary vehicle going forward. And part of that gives us a much longer time frame with assets that, you know, we can do certain things. Like we have a couple of properties in Florida that we own that are coming off their affordability restrictions that we are discussing with local agencies, extending some of the tax abatements and things like that. And it may be what's at 60% of AMI, part of it will go to 80% of AMI, but we're trying to lock in that affordability. I mean, the one thing that, you know, the value add business where you're trying to look at buying assets and doubling the rents is a hard business. It's so much easier to keep people who are at affordable residence at that level over time than trying to double the rents. That's a hard business.
Yeah, and conversely, we see properties come to us where the sponsor will say, well, we're going to cut expenses in half. That's how we're going to do it. We're not going to increase the rent, but we'll cut expenses. That's a very difficult thing to do as well. Everyone's better at it, right? Everyone's a better operator. So it's unless someone's adept at getting some type of tax abatement that the previous owner didn't have, things like that. It's controlling that expense side and doing it better. Is a tough road. It can happen, and there are people who are experts at it, but it's equally as hard, I would say.
I do have somebody asking, is one of the negatives for affordable housing, how much future rental increases are there versus market rate? Which
Well,
whether you're holding it or selling it, I guess that kind of plays into that similar challenge.
Well, certainly you hear these stories of market rate properties going up 15, 20 to 30% a year. I mean, you know, HUD, you know, most affordable housing is dictated by increases in area median income, and those have gone up considerably. I mean, we typically underwrite our deals at 2.5 to at most 4% rent growth, and AMIs in many of the markets we're in have grown double digits. And it doesn't mean we're going to increase rates that much. We try to do it over time. We really try to optimize occupancy and minimize turnover. So, you know, our 2021 turnover was probably 15%, and that's something that we like because that creates more stability in the communities.
And I think where there is steady rental growth in affordable housing, you know, there is the need to take some of it as needed. It's about balancing what your residents need with what you need. I think that there, you know, with increasing expenses, remember you have restricted rents and unrestricted expenses. So it does become a balancing act as to, you know, how you keep up with rising costs. But that being said, we have seen, you know, HUD issue some pretty hefty increase allowances on rents. And, you know, our company decided not to take them in one fell swoop, and in fact to be very measured about how we roll out rent increases, because it is so crucial, especially when you're talking about low-income folks.
That's great to hear, because you know there are spikes every once in a while in those HUD numbers. We've also seen it go the other way, where they've dropped precipitously in certain markets when they do a recalibration, and then you're stuck thinking, okay, well, what happens now to this property from a feasibility standpoint? But when they do have these significant increases, that's great. You could do it, but the tenants can't afford it necessarily. So I'm glad glad to hear that.
Okay. Any final words from our panelists before we wrap things up? I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of the questions. If we can reply to any offline, we certainly will. But unfortunately, we are out of time. We will be sending you all a link when the recording is available, and we do hope that you'll join us for our next MHN webinar on risk management strategies on October 6th. There may be a link in the chat that will take you to more information for that. We'll certainly be advertising it, so keep an eye out for that. If you have enjoyed today's session, we do hope you'll also be able to join us for the next MHN Voices webinar, or join our upcoming commercial real estate discussions offered through our sister brand, Commercial Property Executive. Meanwhile, I'd like to thank our speakers once again for this very interesting discussion, our sponsor Excalibur Capital, and thank you all for joining us today.